Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to be asking ourselves a big question, a question that comes back to the origin in a sense. And this question is, what was Carl Jung's type? Was he, as is commonly believed, an INFJ? Or was he perhaps something else? A common competitor for the INFJ hypothesis is INTP, but maybe we'll try to see which of those two types win. Now, before I move on, still on the topic of INFJs, remember that I've written a book on the INFJ type, The Ecstatic Soul. It's the most in-depth investigation of the INFJ you'll find online. If you have already a thorough understanding of the cognitive function stack of the INFJ, you've read articles. Do you want to go deeper? This is the book to get. Less than $10. All the links are available in the description box down below to all the Amazon websites. If you have any questions, if you can't find your website, just drop me a line and I'll get back to you. Right. Why do people think that Carl Jung is an INFJ? On average, people seem to think that. Why is there another current that not quite as big, but big enough, that thinks that Carl Jung is an INTP? Well, let's look at INFJ first. The INFJ hypothesis in the case of Carl Jung comes from the fact that his work is based so very obviously on strong intuitions and explorations of ideas that went beyond the scientific and into the domain of the speculative, the transcendental. And in this respect, his separation from Freud, relatively early on in his career, as opposed to Freud's career, also nicely exemplifies that in concrete fact, because Freud really wanted to stick to the scientific method of psychoanalysis, or what he conceived to be a scientific/biological method, and Jung didn't. Jung wanted to explore the darkest and deepest recesses of the unconscious. He wanted to explore the archetype. He developed the concept of the collective unconscious. He saw libido as energy, primarily as something that's not purely sexual, something that went beyond the physical instinct. So in this respect, Jung seems like he's much more driven by intuition than someone like Freud, and perhaps than someone who would be merely an auxiliary intuitive. Now, secondly, Jung makes propositions that do seem to be universalistic in nature. Again, this is different from Freud, where Freud doesn't offer solutions for human nature, which is also a result of his biological focus. He focuses his work on what the consequences can be for each individual. Whereas for Jung, and even more so with the collective unconscious and with the archetypes, there's clearly a hint at something that transcends human individuals. And if we were to just zero in on these two concepts, collective unconscious, there's collective in it, archetypes, there's again something collective in it. In fact, the collective unconscious is quite proximate to the concept of archetype. So here we have what seems like the FE function. I will skip on SE inferior in this case. Let's just imagine that it's implied in the NI-SE axis, since NI has already been clarified. Now in the case of TI, again, I think it's quite clear that Jung doesn't really display much in the way of TE. He seems to have a strong T functions in the sense that he's able to make very articulate arguments, to constantly ask himself, what kind of definitions am I using? He always provides lists of definitions in later portions of his works that are sometimes longer, not longer than the work itself, but the equivalent of a few chapters. And he just seems to be relentlessly going at how to get as clear as possible to what he's trying to say. Now, that suggests an INFJ function stack. Why is the INTP rival function stack propounded so often? Well, I think the main reason why it's propounded so often is because Jung said so. Now, actually, Jung didn't say that he was an INTP because he was not using that terminology. You know, that's a terminology that was invented by Myers-Briggs long after Jung. But he did say in an interview that he identified primarily with thinking. And when he says that, meaning he identifies with a thinking function as something that's probably dominant in him. I mean, it is the safest conclusion to draw from what he said in that interview, okay? Doesn't tell us whether it's extroverted thinking or introverted thinking, but since it's pretty clear that he identifies as an introvert, then we might assume that he would be an introverted thinker. Now, he says he's an introverted thinker. Essentially, we can take that to be pretty much implied by his own words. He's an introverted thinker. Question is he saying that he has introverted thinking, because INFJs also do, or is he saying that he is dominated by introverted thinking? In this case, and given that we've already accepted he's almost certainly an intuitive, INTP would be the only alternative, having TI and NE as primary and auxiliary functions. And so we have this clear battle, if you like, this clear challenge, showdown between INFJ and INTP. The thing about INTP is that, and purely again looking at what he said, he says he identified with introverted thinking. In this respect, he was quite right. Why did he not say he identifies with intuition? There's a possibility that he mentions thinking as opposed to feeling, but that he was leaving open the question, what kind of intuition does he exhibit? It's a hypothesis. It's probably a little bit further from certainty than the hypothesis that Jung really did identify as a dominant TI user. But it's a possibility. Now, why would he have identified as a TI user is the really good and interesting question, if we assume that that's exactly what he said, I'm a TI dominant. It's a really interesting question, and I think that it can be dismantled. It can be dismantled so we can finally just all agree that Jung was an INFJ type. So how do we dismantle it? Well, there's a first step that we need to go through. And it's just simply to observe that if INFJ is going to win the day, we're going to have to say pretty much that Jung was right about his type. Wrong about his type. Sorry, he was wrong about his type. Typed himself as a TI dominant, but he's not a TI dominant, he's a TI tertiary. Can we credibly believe that Jung was wrong about his type? Because notice something that's a very good and strong implication that follows from this. It follows that if Jung was wrong about his type, and we take his work so seriously in the typology personality community as we do, then it is not a valid argument to say, it is no longer a valid argument to say, well, I shouldn't trust this channel, or I shouldn't trust this guy's typing services because he's not typed himself correctly. I mean, we're essentially saying Jung failed to do it for himself. So that's an interesting implication, and I wanted to just add it as an aside. How likely is it that he typed himself incorrectly? I think actually it is very likely. I think it is the most likely explanation. And we have to resist the temptation to sacralize Jung, both as a thinker, as an intellect, and as a man capable of introspection. Intellect is never perfect. It's never flawless. Neither is introspection and self-knowledge. Combine the imperfection of both intellect and self-knowledge, and you have the possibility of making a mistake like this, even if you are Carl Jung. And I think that if you look at it a bit more closely, you'll notice that there are reasons why he would have been misled. Remember that in some sections of his books, Jung identifies Nietzsche with thinking. And again, this sounds strange because Nietzsche, reading his books, seems so clear, especially Zarathustra, but also his other books, that he's an NI dominant. And Jung had many typings of NI users as thinkers instead of NI dominants as thinkers instead of N users and dominants. What I would argue, and this could be a little bit controversial, but I don't think it's actually controversial for a lot of experts on Jung or established academics, philosophers, psychologists, who take Jung seriously, his TI is actually not dominant in the sense that his TI is actually not that rigorous, and his TI is actually not that clear. It doesn't have the rigor and the clarity of a TI dominant. If you sacralize Jung, you're going to be tempted to disagree with me. But read any of his books, and you notice that some of his definitions are actually kind of merging into each other. And you notice that sometimes he makes arguments that seem to contradict other arguments. He is more concerned with exploring the possibilities of the intuitive mind than with starting from the premise that everything needs to be watertight logical. And this is probably why he allows himself to go so far into the domain of intuitive speculation. But again, it's better to illustrate with an example. Jung both says that the dominant function is the most conscious function, right? This is an idea that I definitely inherit. I think it makes perfect sense. And he also says that intuition as a type of function, either extroverted or introverted, is unconscious. He says it repeatedly. So there is a vagueness and a lack of clarity and even a contradiction there between saying on the one hand that a dominant function is the most conscious function and that intuition is unconscious. And we have actually inherited that contradiction ourselves. Because sometimes people will say, well, I'm an NI dominant, therefore my NI. And other times people will say, well, I'm unconscious of it. But if you were unconscious of it, how could you talk about it? You could only talk about it in a very, very indirect fashion. So it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. That's not really completely your fault. It's actually inherited from a tension that's unresolved in Jung. And it's unresolved because he was not a TI dominant. If he had been, it would have been resolved. Intuition is unconscious if it's inferior. I'm very happy to say that the NI of an ESTP is unconscious. I'm very happy to say that the NE of an ISFJ is unconscious. But the NE dominance of an INTP is definitely not unconscious, nor is the NI dominance of an INFJ or an INTJ. Now, you see that Jung had this, after all, relatively insecure foundation in terms of a definition of intuition. Lots of really interesting insights to offer, and he's the first to conceptualize these functions, so the merits is huge. But he didn't completely iron out the wrinkles and didn't carve out the boundaries between the different functions and between the unconscious and conscious domains. And so you have intuition in this weird place. And from saying this, I think it's reasonable to assume that given that he has this not completely correct understanding of intuition, or rather he had an understanding of intuition that he was unable to correctly circumscribe, how much more likely does it make it that he was unable to point out that his intuition was dominant? Maybe he thought, what I'm conscious of, I'm so conscious of it, can't be intuition, since I think it's unconscious. So, well, it's there, it's just not very conscious, so it can't be dominant. He thought his thinking was the most conscious, whereas it was his intuition, and he mistook the thinking with the intuition for that reason. That all comes from an unresolved paradox between the most conscious dominant function and the idea that intuition is unconscious by nature. Of course, when that tension is not resolved, you're not going to be able to identify yourself as being a dominant intuitive because it's a contradiction. And I think that's why Jung ended up saying he identified with thinking. He could not say he identified with intuition, because on his premise, it would not be possible to say it. But really, when you look at the facts, there's not a lot of NE, plenty of NI, a TI that's definitely there and probably more proficient than most people's TIs, but still not dominant. And as for the FE, I only remind you of the collective unconscious, the archetypes, and so on. So that's my case for why Jung is an INFJ. Let me know in the comments if you agree, if you disagree. I want to know your arguments. Consider giving me a like and subscribing. And I'll talk to you soon, guys. Bye-bye.